What's a true story from your town that others would believe is an urban legend? A bunch of dumb teenagers rolled a giant boulder down the street and onto the train tracks right in front of a propane station. Well, train derails. Shocking. Spills chemicals all over. Luckily it didn't blow up. Anyways, the teenagers were caught and charged with multiple felonies including terrorism charges. We have Catman in our town. He dresses up, tail, whiskers, etc. and just lives his life as a cat. My uncle married a lady from out of town. And when she moved here we told her about Catman. She thought we were pulling her leg until later that week when she was at the local grocery store and saw him. Fully suited in cat mode. Shopping for groceries. It was a bit of a shock for her. There was a guy who just one night showed up to town. About 40 years old. Didn't know a single word of any language. Some man took him in. Gave him food. Shelter. Taught him how to kinda speak. The guy worked pretty much everywhere around town. Gas stations. Mechanics. Shops. And towards the end, he spent his days randomly walking around town. Dropping into random stores to say hello to people. Take a look at the cop car tires to make sure they're okay. And so on. Everybody in town liked him. But he passed away recently. There was this guy who was a multi-millionaire pig farmer. He held 49 girls and fed them to his pigs. Someone nicked the railway station. The station had been closed and was due to be dismantled. A removal deconstruction company turned up and dismantled it. Then a couple of weeks later, the company the council had actually contracted to clear the site turned up. One of the greatest scams in history was perpetrated on a dismantling company. They believed they had paid the government of France for the right to remove the Eiffel Tower and keep all the metal. When it came time to start the work, the man they paid was nowhere to be found. Whenever they opened up the tower, someone would kill themselves jumping off it. Then they'd shut it up for a year or two until opening it back up and having another one suicide. Didn't help that it was on the grounds of a mental institution and was built by patients. In my hometown, there was a circus train that derailed at the top of a hill which stood at the edge of a lake. The train was submerged completely, killing all living things on board. A man in my town had custody of his 5 children. At one point, he drove to our local Walmart and made the kids get out of the car before driving off in an attempt to abandon them. But the police were called and the man was forced to take the kids back. A few weeks later he murdered all of them and drove across the country to bury their bodies. Their mother is still alive and had fought very strongly for custody during and after the divorce. I don't get how courts do this. There was a story I read about where a mother begged the court not to let her child's father have unsupervised custody. The court didn't listen and the father held the baby almost immediately. It's insane. This isn't a scary or ducked up one particularly. But if you keep an eye on the sea at the lowest of low tides, you can sometimes see the remains of the ancient drowned forest that was submerged and lost around 3,000 years ago. There was a circus elephant that sacrificed itself to save a baby elephant from getting hit by a train. Not sure how widespread the story of Jumbo is, but it's a pretty big deal in my hometown. St. Thomas, Ontario for those wondering. The mayor of my hometown, Toledo, Ohio, submitted a proposal to offer discounts on property near the airport to the deaf community because they wouldn't be bothered by the noise. Aside from the whole let's isolate the hearing impaired outside of town aspect, he refused to accept that the vibrations caused by departing and arriving planes would cause problems for the deaf. When people predictably had problems with his proposal, he went on TV, crying, saying that he was being picked on, and his idea wasn't being given a fair chance. As much as it sounds like Trump, it was McCarthy Finkbeiner. In junior high school we attended a 3-day camping thing at a state park. Found out later that it was a serial killer's dumping ground and there were 2 children's bodies in a barrel on the grounds the entire time. A guy lured homeless people into his house under the pretense of giving them a warm meal and place to sleep. But instead he butchered them. Then he went to town and sold the meat at the main market. He sold it as pork and people actually bought it. He apparently processed more than 40 people within a 3-4 year span. In the 1800s, an eccentric millionaire created a pig farm called the Sanitary Piggery, where the pigs all had their own rooms and beds, in which they slept on silk sheets and ate human food. In my mom's hometown by the ocean, there was a decommissioned lighthouse. The caretaker used to live in it with his family, but it's been abandoned for years. Then, every once in a while, townsfolk would look out toward the ocean at night and see lights on inside the tower. Yet it was all locked up. No electricity. And no signs of forced entry when examined by officials. There was this guy who wanted to test what the best drug is to fight the bubonic plague. So he posed as a scientist. Ordered vials of plague. You could do this in the 90s, no questions asked. And injected a bunch of rats with plague. Luckily the FBI busted his ass. Had a vampire cult in town that consisted mainly of teenagers. The leader and 2 of his followers went to his GF's house in Louisiana and killed her parents to rescue her. They were eventually caught when one of the followers got homesick and called home. There is an infamous river crossing that floods quite a lot during monsoon rains in the summer. And every year a couple of people, tourists usually, try to drive across when they shouldn't and get swept off. And occasionally when it's only a couple feet deep someone, not a tourist, will try wading across. But they inevitably get snatched by a giant 3-4 meter, 11-14 feet, saltwater shark. Happened only a few weeks ago. A dickhead picked up the football, England, in a private school lunchtime football game. He ran with the ball and was tackled. Thus the game of rugby, named after the town, was born. Not that exciting. But a lot of people seem to think it's a myth that my town has a history of drunk spring breakers jumping off their balconies, thinking they can land majestically in the hotel pool many stories below, only to squash on the concrete. But it happens. A true story that for nearly 100 years people in my hometown thought was a myth was that there is a train at the bottom of the lake. Supposedly it ran off the rails in the early 1900s and went into the water. But no one could ever find it. People never really believed it until the Navy found it during a training exercise 20 years ago. Guy crashed his ultralight into the town's main power line during the annual summer town celebration and the whole place was without power for 2 days. On the same day, the llamas from a nearby llama farm escaped and were running wild around town. And the hot air balloon brought in by another of our eccentric residents got untied from its tether and went rouge, eventually landing in a ranch a dozen miles away. Also, I'm pretty sure that was the same day my friend was riding his unicycle in the town parade and fell off and was run over by a fire truck. He was somehow totally fine. But that could have been the next summer. Extra rural Wyoming is a strange place. Edit, unrelated to this event. We also had a few wild, that is, escaped from some rich dude's farm, peacocks running around the forest that surrounded the town. Also had a woman try to open up a daycare where her selling point was that the kids could play with her 2 pet mountain lions. And a guy who owned several camels, though he technically lived in the next town over. Also llamas. Rogue. We had Lorraine. Me and my mom actually knew her daughter and granddaughter. Her granddaughter used to be my babysitter. So I spent a whole lot of time with Lorraine unsupervised. But to most kids who lived in my neighborhood, she was a scary story we told to each other. She had a knack for popping up out of nowhere and vanishing before you could tell anyone what she said. And she had some pretty brutal threats under her belt. She'll kill you and eat you. Throw you in an oven and burn you to bones. Make you disappear and nobody would ever find you. That sort of thing. Her super backstory was how she got kicked out of her daughter's house after cutting toes off of their dog with a butcher knife. Which, I know was true because, again, her granddaughter babysat me. Poor dog. She recovered. But poor dog. She's still wandering around. Chased me home from school in high school. I believe she has some posts about her in the local forums about sneaking onto people's properties with tree branches and sheet and threatening to bludgeon them. Probably still the boogeyman to kids back home. If that's the case. We literally have a lake in my hometown that's one of the most toxic lakes in the North Americas. It was also the third largest city in the US in the 1880s. We have a twin hotel in Lake Late, so this probably won't get noticed. But its occurrence is widely known among Baltimoreans. Since the 1930s. A figure in a black robe carrying a lantern annually places roses and half a bottle of cognac on Edgar Allan Poe's grave. These are left in the early morning. Sometimes accompanied by cryptic letters. The last time these items appeared on his grave was in 2009. And no sightings or reported visits have happened since. Info, thinkport.org. Whenever the topic of Poe comes up, I always mention this. People don't usually believe me. But it's true. We have an Elvis taxi driver. He spends most of his time, including trips to the grocery store, in full Elvis attire. One of the first times I went drinking, he picked me up when I was really drunk and took me home. Excellent service. There was an incident in the 70s or 80s where a light fixture in one of the schools fell on a group of second graders. Everyone survived, but there were some accusations of racially motivated neglect in the maintenance of the school. As a result, the band commissioned the construction and opening of a brand new school with a focus on Native Canadian students. Tourists from somewhere down south came to Valdez, Alaska in a camper with their little dog, stopped at a gas station and decided to let their dog wander to relieve itself while they got gas. A bald eagle swooped down and carried it off. The skeleton and collar was found years later on the roof of a nearby building. The first few penal transport ships to come to Australia were all male convicts. When the first ship of female convicts docked at Sydney Harbour, there was a party and orgy that lasted 3 days. There was a woman in my town a few decades ago, I believe, who was living with an abusive husband. So during the middle of the night, she got out of bed and lit it on fire, killing him. This one time in my town, a white woman climbed the ranks of the NAACP by pretending she was a black woman. The internet found out and she tried to use it to sell paintings. Even worse, it is literally the only thing my town has ever made international news on. Edit, by the time she was found out, she was the head of the local NAACP chapter, writer in the local paper and an instructor at a university. The entire story is worth a Google. A nephew of famous explorer Jake Cousteau, spelling, went to the bottom of our very deep lake, came up, and said, "The world is not ready for what's down there." He is the last and only person ever down there. That lake is Lake Tahoe. Circa. There's a man who still thinks it's the 70s. He walks around town like Disco Stew and is fairly well known. Supposedly, he had some sort of brain damage. He works as a truck driver. Rumor has it that it's gone on so long that he now thinks it's the 80s. I did see him recently with a large, battery-powered boombox, strutting his stuff at a bus stop. A hippo escaped from a traveling circus and made its way into the local creek and no one could get it out. They telegraph stop trains hippo loose to nearby cities and did eventually get it out of the muck after basically causing a shutdown. Now the whole town is obsessed with them and nearly every business and local resident have a hippo statue displayed, and they do like dress up contests with them and paint them all different colors and such. Here are some examples of the statues. andrewbutlerphotos.com. There's an old military base in the city that once has been a place where some anti-government forces and the army fought a battle. The place was abandoned due to that, and now there is a family of foxes and some wildlife. People outside the surrounding neighborhoods thinks this is a wasteland. Link, Google.com. There's a mysterious homeless man who each day rides his bike, pulling a wagon full of stuffed animals behind it, to the nearby city, which must take him a long time as it's 30-40 minutes by car, to collect more stuffed animals for the wagon. He's been run over 3 different times but always survives and gets a new bike. Ron Paul raised his kids in my hometown. He was our representative. One of them was a competitive swimmer. So he built the kid an Olympic-sized training pool. After the swimming dream died, they kept it around as a semi-public pool. So all the kids in my town have peed in Ron Paul's pool. There was a chapter of the Klan that met in a cave under my town in the 1930s. Although they were quite open about it, the local newspapers didn't really report on their activities. So it became something of a legend or a story that the old timers mentioned. Then there was a huge rainstorm in the 1980s that caused the retaining wall that sealed the mouth of the cave to crack open. In a nicely metaphorical moment, a large colony of rats was driven out of the tunnel by the floodwaters and infested the houses for blocks. When people started asking questions about what the heck happened, the history re-emerged. There was, or is, this guy from my hometown everyone called Acid Andy. His parents were rich and he still lived with them. But he was 40 something and extremely burnt out from too much acid in his youth. He would ride everywhere on his bike. Unemployed and always stoned. You'd see him at the video store. Then run into him at the gas station 2 days later. You'd pass him on your way home once or twice a week. He looked like a mashup of Slash and Weird Al. And he rarely spoke except in a long, drawn-out stoner's drawl. He was known to randomly pay it forward, buying your pack of smokes for you if you were line in front of him at the White Hen. Or buying 2 large fries at McDonald's and handing one of them to you as he turned away from the counter to take his seat.